I was born in 1965, so I grew up in England in the 1970s. So I remember watching this program called Love Thy Neighbour, and that's where I first heard this word term racialism, because that's what discrimination according to somebody's race was called back then. The term racism came into popular usage in the 1980s. Anyway, I've got a few thoughts on this issue. So the first one is, if you actually have to, if you want to try and pin what racism amounts to, it's treating people differently according to their race. So you then have to think, well, what human races exist and where are the dividing lines? And that's where this whole topic becomes quite problematic very, very early on. So if you take Meghan Markle as an example, now for me, she looks white, but she says that she's black. But then is she really mixed race? Because I think one of either a mother or a father was white, and they've had a kid, haven't they? And Harry is, I presume he's white. That's what he says. So is their kid mixed race, or is it white? At what point, if their kid eventually has a child of their own, and they marry another white person, at what point would that person stop being mixed race, and at what point would they become white? Another thing might be, the dividing line between somebody who's black and somebody who's mixed race. So it's nebulous, basically. This whole concept. Um, that's not to say that discrimination doesn't exist. So what I would say is that discrimination involves treating people differently according to stuff that they can't change. For example, like their nationality. So I would definitely say that what Wimbledon's done this year, in terms of banning Russian players, that definitely falls under the umbrella of discrimination, doesn't it? Is it racism? Are the Russians a race of their own? I bet some people would say that they are. They've probably got some. I know, in fact, they do have some very specific genetic features. There are some common traits. Over here in Finland, Finland's known for being genetically homogenous, and this is why, prior to all of this nonsense, a lot of drug trials were done over here in Finland because of that fact. So, you know, again, you can think about another ism, not racism, sexism. So, treating women differently to men um, because of their gender, their sex, whatever you want to call it. So, on the one hand, you can say, well, the type of sexism that people are interested in is stuff like um, equal representation in the boardroom. If women are underrepresented in top level banking, that's an example of sexism. But then again, if women are underrepresented in plumbing, putting their hands down shitty block toilets, men are far more likely to end up doing that job than women, then that's not sexism. And the same would apply to the army. That's far more men are in the army. Men are treated very differently in most armies to women. They're the ones that actually go out and stick a bayonet in somebody's chest. The women, on the other hand, tend to get the more cushy back office jobs, but that's not sexist. So um, another thing is, do we actually want to live in a society where everybody is treated equally? In other words, is some discrimination acceptable or indeed desirable? So when I was a teacher, I used to sort of say to students, imagine that you were doing a minimum wage job, maybe working in a fast food joint. Would it be fair for you to be paid the same amount of money as somebody who was constantly late, skived off, didn't really try hard at work, would that be fair? Because I think a lot of students are kind of indoctrinated into viewing equality of outcome as being like a non-negotiable. It's something that must always happen. So there's also that. What about culture? Are we allowed to discriminate according to culture? Are we allowed to view some cultures as being better than others? Well, I would say from my observations, the typical Guardian reader, from the southeast, they're very comfortable with the idea of holding some cultures in high esteem and other cultures in the gutter. So for example, they would say, well, the culture in the southeast, it's more sophisticated than those like those scumbag northerners, And also, if you think about a country like Afghanistan, they would say, well, it's okay there. There's not many women's rights there, but we're not gonna criticize that country because well, there's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's like what do they call it? Intersectionality, kind of. In this case, the desire to avoid being referred to as somebody who discriminates according to religion is kind of trumping the desire to avoid being accused of being sexist. Yeah, so it's almost like these people are the real racists because they have a patronizing attitude towards some people and cultures. They hold some cultures, they don't expect much from some people, and that's why they need to be helped more by the state. For me as a libertarian, what I would say is if you want to live in a civilized society, there must be equality under the law, and then also the state must treat each of its citizens equally in a colourblind manner. I would be my own view on racism is Martin Luther King's. That you should treat people according to the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, particularly when it comes to the state. So I would say it's the progressives, that are the real racists here. Also, what I would say too is that if you want to eliminate racism, the best way of doing it is to have an economy with a small government and a big private sector. Because if you think about the private sector, it has to make a profit to survive. So that creates a very powerful incentive then not to discriminate. So let's take an example. Suppose that you had an employer who genuinely was racist, that they were regularly turning away, let's say, black prospective workers who were intelligent and capable of doing a really good job in favour of hiring white private schoolboys who were of lesser intelligence. If that was the case, then what would happen is that business that practiced discrimination would quickly be put out of business by other companies competing who practiced a more rational employment policy that was based on profit maximisation. So the free market actually creates a very, very powerful incentive for there to be no discrimination. You're going to hire the best person for the job, because the best person for the job is going to help you to maximise your revenue and minimise your costs. And if you're a racist and you're hiring people for other reasons apart from their competency, then your profits are going to suffer. Now, if you think about the government, from my perspective, it's the government that's more likely to practice racism because they don't have to make a profit. There is no penalty. Your money doesn't come from the customer, it comes from the taxpayer. And unlike customers who have a choice, in the private sector, all exchange is voluntary. If I decide that Virgin Trains is a rip-off, or if I decide that I don't want to buy a Tesla or Heinz baked beans anymore, I can withdraw from that contract. In contrast, though, if you look at the transactions that people take part in with the government, that is not based on a voluntary transaction, a voluntary exchange. It's based on compulsion. So if you decide that you want to stop your exchange with the government and not pay taxes, then eventually, after a few warning letters and threatens to be taken to court, you'll end up with a knock at the door with some blokes with some big sticks, and they'll use violence against you, and they'll hold you hostage. That means taking you to prison until you pay up. So the state doesn't have, there is no incentive for the state to treat people equally. In fact, the incentive from the state's point of view is to play massive divide and rule games, which is to say to one group of people, you're being discriminated against by another group of people, and vote for us, and if you do that, we'll use our power, the boys with the big sticks, to go around and steal their stuff and give it to you. So really, in summary then, what I'm saying is that the incentive for racism, it comes from politicians. They're the ones that can get away with it, and they do it because it provides a very powerful excuse or reason for the government to grow larger. And as the government grows larger, these politicians, who are mostly psychopaths attracted by power, that's the type of person that goes into politics, the least stable amongst us, the people that couldn't make it in the free market, who desire power over others. Racism's great for them, because they can throw that accusation around and say, I've got the solution, and the solution is I'm going to use the power of the state to even things up by treating people differently. That's exactly what they do. I think it was Mises that said that social justice involves the state treating people unequally in order to make them equal. In fact, I think it was Murray Rothbard. I'll check that. It was an Austrian school economist anyway, and it was a good quote that I had on my classroom wall before the chief fascist pulled it all down the microsecond after I walked out of the school gates, allegedly. So I hear. Yeah, the other issue is money laundering as well. That I think politicians, they use money, racism, to launch all sorts of government schemes that are designed to help, and mysteriously these help schemes, the money ends up into the pockets of their cronies. And then the final one, I guess, is a divide and rule strategy. That's what racism's about in Britain. And they've been trying this for ages and ages and ages. What I've noticed in my life, I'm not really, I'll judge people according to the content of their character. I'm not really bothered at all. What I am bothered about is like politicians stoking up hatred by saying that this group over there, they all hate you. Their ancestors did this to you, and they must pay a price. And it's all about fueling hatred. And what would I do about it? I would minimise the state, and I'm quite extreme actually in that I would get rid of passports. And you can do that. You can get rid of passports, have completely open borders, but no more welfare, no more government housing, no more free taxpayer-funded education, taxpayer-funded healthcare. All of that would have to go, and it would have to become completely private. Because you can't have both. You can't have freedom of movement and taxpayer-funded healthcare, taxpayer-funded education, and retirement pensions and tax credits and all of that jazz. Because what you'll just do is create welfare arbitrage. People from countries where there is no welfare and the living standards are quite low will choose to emigrate and move to countries where there is a welfare state, especially if they don't even have to pay into that system before they can start claiming it.